Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining the Oxford Political Review for this live-streamed event today. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dominic Grieve. Dominic served as the Member of Parliament for Beaconsfield between 1997 and 2019, during which time he held the position of Attorney General for England and Wales during the coalition government. More recently, Dominic served as the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, and during that role, he was central to putting together the report on Russian interference in the UK, something we're sure to talk about later on. Dominic, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It's a pleasure.
The way this interview will work is that I will ask some questions before we turn to the questions that have been submitted by our readers, and I'm grateful for those that are watching online. This event is being streamed on our Facebook and YouTube channels. The first area I wanted to cover is the big question on many people's minds right now, though not something that is being discussed in the media quite as much as you would expect, and that is, of course, the state of the negotiations with the European Union and whether any long-term relationship will be reached before the 31st of December. We've passed the transition period where we can extend, we've passed the deadline where we can extend the transition period. But the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen remains optimistic. She said yesterday that the talks are going well, making good progress. Do you share her optimism?
A very difficult question to answer. In one sense, yes, because it seems to me that logically the areas of difference that remain between the UK and the EU ought to be capable of being bridged. Mm-hmm. There appear to be two. The first one is the question of state aid. And frankly, on state aid, I've always found it very hard to understand as a Conservative, admittedly no longer a member of the Conservative Party, what on earth the government is going on about. I find it inconceivable that they should want to dole out state aid in a way that would be in breach of the EU's own rules. So whilst there appears to be a sovereignty issue, we want to do a deal with you where we do not wish to give you a categorical assurance that we might not do state aid. The reality is I don't think we have any intention of doing state aid on a scale that would put us in breach of the EU's general rules on this. So I find it hard to understand what it is that we're arguing about. That said, I'm mindful of the fact that there seems to be this idea that we should be pouring money into new technologies. But actually, if we're pouring money into research, that's already permissible. So again, I don't quite understand what that's about. The second issue is about fisheries. Well, this is a totemic, symbolic issue. And I do appreciate that if we're leaving the EU, which I'm obviously on record thinking is a pretty bad idea, I do have to accept that one of the few areas where you can show a direct benefit is recovering control of your own economic seas. And so it is a totemic issue, and unfortunately it matters as much to countries like France as it does to us, because for them it does actually have an economic impact. For us, the economic impact on the fishing communities is there, but in terms of the overall economic benefit to UK PLC, it is absolutely minuscule. Mm-hmm. Somebody pointed out to me the benefit of the interconnector for sharing energy, which was also likely to be part of this deal, is 6 times as valuable as fisheries. So again, I would have thought it ought to be possible to resolve it. I do happen to think that the French are behaving badly over this. I think they have got to accept that there is likely to be annual renegotiation of access. And the irony is that I suspect if there is annual renegotiation of access, well, probably, at least for the foreseeable future, there will be quite a lot of it for the French, because the reality is we don't have the capacity to exploit all our seas, our inshore fishing. That's one of the reasons why we didn't end up with the quotas which people would now wanted the UK to have before we left the EU. We didn't have them because we weren't concerned with obtaining them. We were doing deep sea fisheries in the North Atlantic. So that too ought to be capable of being resolved. But I wouldn't get terribly carried away with this, because even if we do those things and we get a deal, the deal's still quite thin, and it's not at all clear to me what bits of deals, say justice and security cooperation, professional mutual recognition and access for professionals into each other's jurisdictions? Are any of those things going to be in it? Or is it literally just going to be no tariffs on goods movements, in which case the economic impact will be not dissimilar to leaving with no deal at all?
I mean, the government have been characterising their potential solution as an Australian-style solution, and you know full well that that's pretty thin.
It's a non-solution. I mean, it's not a non-solution, but it's effectively a no-deal solution.
And do you think that there is potential for something more akin to the Canada-style arrangement, or is time running out?
I don't know. My feeling is that time may well be running out for a Canada-style deal by the 31st of December. What I can foresee happening is that we end up with, I suppose, what I would call a thin deal, a basic deal, to prevent lorries piling up in Kent and enable the movement of goods to continue. And then what's actually going to happen is that next year we will start a long cycle of negotiations, probably almost sectoral, over quite a prolonged period of time, in which gradually we will rebuild some of the links that we have severed. I mean, there is a profound irony about all this, but the geographical reality of where the United Kingdom is located and where our closest trading partners are located and where our long-term security interests are located, I think makes it inevitable that any government, even Boris Johnson's government, will have to start doing that talking. And in the meantime, it will be disruptive.
I mean, Brexit was a big part of your parliamentary career, certainly towards the end of your time as an MP. And this time last year, you were sat not as a Conservative MP, but as an independent MP. You and 20 other Conservatives, along with the likes of Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, had the whip withdrawn for your act of rebellion. A lot's changed since then, it's fair to say. Boris reopened the withdrawal agreement, though many say it was cosmetic changes rather than anything particularly substantive. Stormed to victory in the election and of course did deliver withdrawal from the European Union earlier this year. Do you, with hindsight, have any regrets about your decision to rebel? Would you rather be in Parliament right now?
No, I have no regret about the decision to rebel. I couldn't face being in Parliament, and I suppose I could face being in Parliament as an independent, although whether in that capacity I would be doing anything very significant in view of the government's current majority, I think the reality is not. I might be pontificating and making speeches and doing quite a lot of media, but I wouldn't be doing anything else. Would I want to be in Parliament in government in a party led by Mr. Johnson? The answer to that is no. And I think that for me was the decisive issue this time last year. I realise Mr. Johnson is a man of some talents, but he's also, it seems to me, a man of really significant flaws. And in many ways, the last 12 months, I regret to say, have been even worse than I thought they would be in terms of the style of government that he's delivering. Admittedly, he's also had some difficult situation to face, and COVID is a very unusual circumstance. But still, it doesn't make any difference. And it's awful to say it, but because politicians who say "I told you so" doesn't serve any useful purpose unless you can try to prevent "I told you so" happening. And I haven't. But I look at what has happened and some of the things I thought would happen, and several of them have come to pass. And the most obvious was that he deceived the electorate over the terms of his own withdrawal agreement, because he's now been trying to renege on parts of it, to the utter dismay of Parliament, and indeed the huge damage to the United Kingdom's reputation in international law terms. I mean, there's one example. I told the DUP, I remember this time last year, well, earlier than that, it was back in September, August, you're about to be sold down the river by the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister kept on insisting he wasn't. But the truth is, the deal he struck, as we pointed out in late October, had serious consequences for the unity of the United Kingdom, which he successfully glossed over. I take my hat off to him for his ability to carry out this sort of charlatanry of persuading people that black is white. And he was very good at it. But the fact is, that is what happened. And as you may recall, I mean, firstly, some of us tried to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and we were successful in that. That's why we lost the whip. But then he went and got a deal, which, in my view, had it been properly scrutinised, the flaws would have started to appear, which was hoping that that might be a trigger for people to say, well, perhaps we ought to go back to the public and ask them in the second referendum if this is what they really want. And he didn't want that for obvious reasons. So he avoided it by holding an election where he said, I've got a wonderful deal, we can now leave. But that wonderful deal has at least partially unravelled. And there is the very real risk that we may actually, as again some of us predicted, end up leaving with no deal at all on the 31st of December of this year, which of course is not what he promised at any stage.
Yeah, you've mentioned a number of issues there, particularly the internal market bill. I wanted to ask you what you make of it in terms of how we best interpret it. It's obviously been met with vociferous opposition. The last 5 prime ministers have all expressed their disapproval. Is it about territorial integrity, as the government say, or is it potentially really about frustrations with state aid and the rules around state aid? Or indeed, maybe as others have suggested, this could be an attempt to appease hardline Brexiteers to later soften them up for concessions, perhaps, that will be made to any long-term agreement. What do you think about the internal market bill and how we make sense of it?
I suspect it was a miscalculation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I don't see any justification for having brought in the new clauses into the internal markets bill, which were in breach of international law. Once they'd done it, they then started articulating some argument that the negotiations had made them realise that the EU was operating in bad faith on this, and that if we left under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, there was a very serious risk that it would be impossible to send goods over to Northern Ireland supermarkets, and the shelves would be empty, and there would be a requirement to carry out checks, and they were essentially going to act to pinch off trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I just don't think that's very likely. Of course, the EU wants to cut a deal that favours the EU, but the reason why the EU went to all the trouble of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and indeed previously the Northern Ireland backstop, was because they wanted to uphold the Good Friday Agreement. And I can think of little more capable of undermining it than if the EU was seen as offending unionist and loyalist opinion in Northern Ireland in that fashion. I mean, it would be a recipe for disaster, which is why I think it's improbable. It is true, however, that the deal that he signed up to could well require border checks. And he glossed that, as we were just discussing, and he didn't like it. And it certainly goes down badly with a section of the Conservative Party. And I think he introduced these clauses because he thought it would give greater leverage in the course of the negotiations with the EU by showing a determination of intent by the UK government. And I think it backfired, and I think this is quite interesting because I think he failed to appreciate just what a storm it was going to initiate, even amongst people like Michael Howard, Lord Howard, who had previously been Brexit supporters. And that raises also an interesting question, which is how on earth could a government succeed in bringing these clauses in without the Whitehall machinery, including the law officers, saying, do you really realise what you're doing here and how damaging this is going to be? Have you thought this through? The impression I have is it simply didn't happen. That's why Jonathan Jones, the Treasury solicitor, resigned. So I think it was a miscalculation, and indeed the backpedaling that has taken place since makes me feel that far from delivering the extra leverage, this has turned into something of an own goal, which is one of the reasons why I'm saying this is a chaotic, I didn't use that word a moment ago, but it is in fact a chaotic government. So leaving aside the Brexit, where reasonable people may disagree. The hallmark of Boris Johnson's leadership is he's leading a chaotic government. And this is also apparent in the context of COVID.
Mm. Yeah, I want to take you back just there to, you mentioned Jonathan Jones, of course, resigning. So too did Lord Keane, the Advocate General for Scotland. But one of your successors, Suella Braverman and Robert Buckland, stayed in place, and they came under pressure to resign. The legal profession were up in arms about their support for these clauses. Are you concerned that there is an absence of ministerial responsibility within this government? And the first people that seem to go are the civil servants.
Yes, I am, very. The Attorney and the Solicitor General should never have allowed the bill to be published. They actually have a role over the publication of the bill. And the legal opinion that was produced to back up the government's case is, you can produce any legal opinion you like, but it is so eccentric as to be really off planet. That's the best way I can describe it. I know that they went to a number of academic lawyers who have had bees in their bonnet about international law for some time, but they do represent what can only be described as tiny minority opinion about international law and its impact and how the United Kingdom should respond to it. And one of the things they said was a truism. If international law clashes with domestic legislation takes priority. I don't disagree with that. But that doesn't justify an executive deliberately setting out to breach international law by introducing primary legislation in Parliament. Just doesn't. So yes, I worry about that. The Lord Chancellor in a very difficult position, and I think the words he's expressed make that clear. He's taken an oath of office to respect the rule of law. The rule of law, in my view, includes our international legal obligations. He's hung on in there, I think, on the basis that he feels that going might make things worse, and I detect he hopes that it will never be used. And I rather suspect, but I might be wrong, that if it ever were to be used, he would feel constrained to go. And you can then make a moral debate about whether he should go when he was required to arguably breach his oath by going to vote at second reading for something which did not respect the rule of law, or whether he's right to stay in the hope that he can influence this in the right direction. And as he's an old friend, I'm not going to, I think I recognize that it is a very considerable moral dilemma and different people might approach it differently.
This government have been in a perennial state of conflict with the law for some time. Boris Johnson's first ministry came up against the Supreme Court with prorogation case, of course, and attempts to put Parliament into prorogation. In terms of the government's what seems like current feud with the legal profession over activist lawyers, this term, this label that's being bandied about a lot by the Home Secretary, by even the Prime Minister. You're, of course, a barrister. Since leaving Parliament, you've gone back into legal practice. What sort of damage do labels like that do to the confidence of the public in the legal profession, and why are members of the government so happy using them?
This is a populist government. It enjoys creating culture wars with any entity which it thinks might stand in its way or where it thinks it might have some public support in doing it. And left-wing activist lawyers has a certain resonance with part of their core support group, particularly as it deflects attention from the fact that the reality is that the government is not really being honest about the immigration law problems it faces. With fairness to this government, no government has ever been honest about the challenges of immigration and how they can best be met within a rule of law state. And that unwillingness to have that debate, coupled with the fact that there's public pressure because people see desperate people landing in small boats on Kent beaches, means that you have to have some sort of displacement activity. And the displacement activity is to say, oh, well, this would all be different if there weren't left-wing activist lawyers, which is complete and total nonsense. So I'm afraid I think they do actually enjoy picking fights. We could see it last year. And it was notable over prorogation. It was notable over their willingness to smear people. I mean, there are some aspects, I'm afraid, of the current government which give me real cause for concern, because in a way, Westminster governments, even if they're efficient or not efficient, have tended historically in the modern period in Britain to operate within certain frameworks, which I might call a framework of respectability and predictability. And the interesting thing about Boris Johnson's government is that when it's confronted with difficult issues, and of course Brexit's a very difficult issue, I recognise that if you're trying to promote it, but they've been prepared to step outside the framework and to do it in a way which raises great tension. And in a country with an unwritten constitution is quite challenging. And then, of course, if they don't succeed, they look for somebody else to blame.
You mentioned the Westminster style of governance, and I wanted to ask you really about your own experience as an independently minded MP. And of course, you were subsequently ousted from the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Does that serve as an example of how our political system is perhaps not working in its current state? The mandate theory is that a constituency elects a representative, and they act with the authority of those constituents to serve in their best interest. But at the same time, the whipping system, which of course you well know, backbenchers particularly are discouraged from exercising their independence. Can there ever be a sort of a future where independence can be exercised in Parliament? And can you tell us a little bit about your experience campaigning to be an independent MP?
I'll try to take both the stages.
Yeah.
The whipping system, one has to accept that if you're going to have a working parliament and a working government, there has to be a degree of discipline and loyalty to party. So I'm not going to complain about a system which comes in and which imposes loyalties on MPs. After all, I was elected in 2017. This was one of the criticisms that was made of me on a Conservative Party manifesto. But most political parties do allow a considerable degree of latitude to their MPs and at times are prepared to tolerate rebellion. Indeed, Theresa May had to tolerate rebellion, and at times even rebellion from me, but it never interfered with, I think, her appreciation of my basic loyalty to the party, although clearly things got very stressed because of the way the ERG were pulling her deal apart. And there were some of us at the other end who were pushing back against this because we could see it was all going to end very badly. The toxicity has crept in, partly because Brexit was a piece of direct democracy. And so in the background of the issues around Brexit when debated in Parliament was that as this was the will of the people, nobody had any right to question anything or indeed interfere with anything. And as you saw with some of the refrains, I mean, the original Miller case was, how dare it be the case that Parliament even has to sanction the issue of the Article 50 notice, even though actually Parliament cheerfully did it once it was told that the government had to seek it. And yet, if you'd listened to the commentary after the Miller case, and it judges enemies of the people, and anybody suggesting that we weren't leaving immediately and unconditionally, even though none of those things were in fact possible, was a traitor. So things did get very heated. And I'm the first to recognize that in my rebelliousness and in arguing for a second referendum, I was offending, which I didn't do initially, but I started to argue for it because I thought it was the only way out. Indeed, accepting that the second referendum might deliver the same verdict as the first, but it still seemed to me to be worthwhile rather than leaving in the extraordinary fashion in which we eventually did. So I have to accept that that was likely to upset some people. It certainly upset some members of my constituency association very much. And it eventually led to my losing the party whip. And I'm sorry for that. And I wish it hadn't happened. But I don't actually blame ultimately the party for withdrawing the whip, if that was their right to do it, and I had to live with the consequences. The toxicity of the debate, however, was not necessary. And I would have preferred it not to have happened in that way. And that was deeply unpleasant, and in fact showed a degree of undermining of parliamentary democracy and the right of MPs to make their own decisions. Now, as to your second question, I really enjoyed standing as an independent MP, a candidate. I was very fortunate. I had an immense amount of support. Large numbers of people materialised to help me. I always knew it was going to be an uphill struggle, and my expectations were not very high at the beginning and were lower by the end of it, partly because of the absolute unelectability of Jeremy Corbyn. So the difficulty was that I was trying to ask constituents to make what might have been quite a sophisticated decision, that they could safely elect me as an independent who might be able to influence the course of Brexit thereafter. Trying to reassure them that I had no intention of putting Corbyn into Downing Street, when in the course of the election really came down to which of the, for many people, which is the lesser of two evils. A over-optimistic, unreliable and indeed dishonest individual who is quite clever, or somebody who appears to have views which are so utterly repellent to many people that they couldn't contemplate seeing his party in Downing Street. And that was where the problem lay. Now, even if that problem hadn't existed, I'm not saying that I would then have won the seat, but it was always going to be difficult to do. Do I regret standing as an independent? Is it an enriching experience? Yes, it was all those things, and some great acts of kindness, loyalty, and indeed generosity from a lot of people who came to help me. Obviously, I didn't plan to end my political career in the House of Commons in that fashion, and it's not what I would have wished, but I have no regrets about it at all.
Well, before we turn to audience questions, something I wanted to ask you about for some time is the Russia report, which is another source of government controversy, I would suggest. You, of course, were central to putting that report together. You wanted to get it published around this time last year, I believe, but it wasn't published until July this year. And it might not have been published but for the election of Julian Lewis, who himself had the whip withdrawn. So two questions I had. First of all, how the government tried to manipulate the election of the chair for the Intelligence Security Committee to get Chris Grayling into that chair role. What does that tell us about the workings of Number 10? And then secondly, why was the issue of Russian interference in the UK not a priority for previous governments?
I'll take those two in stages. The decision to interfere with Julian's, or with the constitution of the committee, was scandalous and shows a micromanagement in Downing Street that I find quite astonishing. I mean, bear in mind that the committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, sorry, that's my clock in the background. The Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament is now on a statutory basis since 2013 and 2015. Its new format came in. It is specified that the committee is ultimately in the Prime Minister's gift, but the election of the chair is in the gift of the committee, and they make that decision. So for the Prime Minister, having essentially ensured, one would have liked to have thought, that the people on the committee were acceptable to him, including the opposition members, and that's his right because of its access to classified material, should not have tried to decree who became the chair of the committee. And that decision was foolish, backfired on them, another example, and as I say, is another example of this government acting, I think, outside the constitutional and conventional framework. Then you have to ask, why didn't they publish the Russia report? And just to make a couple of things clear, my committee is a committee of 9. It's not just bipartisan, it's non-partisan. You wouldn't know if you came and sat in on a committee meeting who belongs to which political party. At least 2 members of the committee were leavers. This was not a leave remain committee where there were those issues being played out as the committee approach. We go where the evidence is. We were concerned about Russia. We wanted to put in the public domain as much as possible, fully in the knowledge that a lot of it would remain classified and couldn't be published. We went to a lot of trouble to produce this report, and moreover, we went to some trouble to try to bring it out in October, early November last year, because we could see there was a general election coming down the road, and we wanted to get it out of the way. And the intelligence agencies and the cabinet secretariat cooperated with us in that. It was the prime minister who decided not to publish it, and I'm afraid he gave a bogus explanation as to why he had not done it, which was he needed 6 weeks to consider further redactions. This is complete and total rubbish. If he had a good reason why he couldn't publish, he should have called me into Downing Street in late October and said, look, Dominic, I know we disagree on many things, but I need to explain to you what the national security imperative is, why this can't be published. He never did. There wasn't one. It was his decision that he didn't want it. Now, as to why he didn't want it, even now, I don't think I'm going to engage in speculation, or at least not much. Yes, it highlighted areas of, I think, serious deficiency in the way we've approached the Russian threat. And that does extend to political parties and Russian influence. But do bear in mind, this report was not just about the referendum or about Russian oligarchs in the United Kingdom, some of whom, I should make absolutely clear, may well be very patriotic and wish above all to put a lot of distance between themselves and Russia and have become British nationals and citizens. But we wanted to highlight how Russia exercises influence, most of which is entirely nefarious. Right. And I don't know why he didn't publish it. He was entitled, if he had published it, to say, look, I agree with this report. Of course, I've only been in government for a short time. We will do something about it as soon as possible. I think they may have been embarrassed about bits of it or felt it might have a bearing on the election. I don't think it probably did, but it certainly generated more heat over the election period by the refusal to publish than I think would have taken place if they had actually had the courtesy to publish it when they should.
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting time when it came out in July, but I don't think it quite got the attention that that what you're describing that it deserved, and the importance of it really is central to an understanding of what's been interference for a number of years and has been largely kept out of the public domain. Dominic, I want to turn now to the audience questions, and we've got a number of questions to try and get through in the time available. First question is from Nikita Grezin, who is a master's student at St Anthony's College in Oxford. And he asks, which is reads like an essay, do you agree with the statement, Global Britain looks set to remain a title in search of an author? I think this question in case you outside of the EU. To add to Nikita's question, maybe, what do you make of the government's global Britain ambition, and particularly with the US election around the corner next week on Tuesday? What impact do you think a Joe Biden victory will have on the special relationship?
Well, it may be a reality check. I don't think Joe Biden, take that first. I don't think Joe Biden's election will have a particular impact on it. The special relationship, by my definition, is that the United Kingdom, through the Five Eyes partnership, has an exceptionally close security cooperation with the United States. And evidence suggests that it has deepened over the years. It's undoubtedly one of mutual respect. We need each other. And I think that it would need the active interference of a president to destroy it, just as it would need the active interference of a prime minister to destroy it, because essentially it continues because it exists, and it doesn't need to be managed, actually, particularly at a ministerial level. Special relationship in the sense of Britain is our #1 partner in the globe. I think that's always been rather more dubious and has been a sort of reassurance that Brits have given themselves over the years about our importance to the US in sort of overall defense and strategic terms. Now, of course, we're important. We have bases that the US uses. We have historically been a reliable partner in joining in coalition operations with the US, although clearly the experience in Iraq has been quite denting to that. And I think we intend to try to remain so, although I'm afraid that our military power is continuing to wane and will continue to wane as long as we spend 2% of our GDP on it in relative terms in a world where there are other countries that are spending more. I worry about that because the UK historically has punched above its weight. Now, we then come to the punching above its weight. The UK punching above its weight in the last 60 years has to do with the fact that in giving up our empire, we did actually succeed after a number of difficulties in finding a niche where we both maintained a reasonable level of economic growth so that we were competitive. And at the same time, we acquired a reputation of being a rule of law state that believed in a rules-based international system and was recognized for that. And because it was appreciated, particularly by smaller states who otherwise get bullied by larger ones, we were seen as having a key role in the international order. Now, I'm afraid, I think that is directly threatened by Brexit. The Internal Markets Bill is one example, but actually, I think our capacity to exercise influence is damaged in the short to medium term by our giving up our influence within the EU. And as I noticed as chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee in meeting with interlocutors from non-EU states who have security partnerships with the UK, many of them by 2019 were beginning, initially they didn't understand it. And then by 2019, they were beginning to say, but where's this all going? This all looks chaotic. What's the strategy? What's the plan? Now, I don't know. I don't wish to be totally pessimistic. I can see that the UK may, in its global Britain agenda, recover enough economic competence to start rebuilding a series of relationships which may be subtly different to the ones we had previously, but nevertheless put us back in that position. But I think it's going to be very difficult, and we have certainly shed a lot of influence in order to try and get new influence elsewhere. And I fear that actually it will turn out that much of that new global Britain is a complete mirage. But I may be wrong, because it's very intangible, and at the moment it's far too early to make a definitive statement on whether this is going any chance of working or not. But the omens, to my mind, are not very good.
The next question is a bit closer to home. It's from Dr. Craig Darzel, who is the head of policy and research of the think tank Commonweal, and he writes, Brexit has opened or at least laid bare deep cleaves between the nations of the United Kingdom. The prospect of Scottish independence, Irish reunification, and even Welsh independence are being discussed more than ever before. Indeed, adding to what Dr. Craig has said, just this morning I saw that a JL Partners poll found a 12-point lead for Scottish independence, and the principal reason for that was a loathing of Boris Johnson. So is the UK now on an inevitable path to breaking up or some form of looser constitutional arrangement?
I suspect we're not on the way at the moment to a looser constitutional arrangement. We are at serious risk of breaking up in the context of Scotland. Northern Ireland is also very complicated, but oddly enough, perhaps slightly different. So I shall park that for the moment. I mean, my view's always been, I expressed it. If the consequence of devolution is to give the other nations of the United Kingdom, other than England, a separate identity from the United Kingdom. And whilst in my experience, and I go to Scotland a lot, I think one can exaggerate the extent to which Scottish opinion is different from that in England. I actually happen to think on the vast majority of matters, it is not. It simply reflects the fact that Scottish demographics, the balance between urban and rural, the nature of rural and the nature of urban are different, just as you get that diversity in England. I don't think we think along completely different lines. But that said, if the unit carries out an act which is not desired by a clear majority, and that was obviously the case in Scotland, namely leaving the EU, it's bound to put the relationship under great strain. And as I said a year ago, it threatens the union directly. I don't think it does in Wales, although even in Wales, one can see how that might develop. But for various reasons, I think it's much harder to see that there. Now, the added to this is, as you say, a loathing of Boris Johnson. And that doesn't come as a surprise, partly because his personality seems to me to represent a streak of Britishness, which I think is rather alien in Scotland. Added to which, we have had 12 months of incompetent government. We haven't come to talk about COVID. I'm actually quite sympathetic to the government over COVID, in the sense that I'm not sure that the actual decisions made at the end of the day would be very different from what I think they should have been, or indeed that we weren't going to make lots of mistakes. Every European country has done it. But the tone of his leadership, it looks chaotic and dishonest. And that goes down spectacularly badly with sections of the UK electorate, including, for that matter, in Britain, in England. But I think in Scotland, it has fueled this. And the bright side to look at it is that if Boris Johnson were ever to go and to be replaced by a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who goes down better in Scotland, you might find some of the current surge towards independence being moderated quite quickly. But of course, once people get into the habit of thinking in a particular way, it's much harder to make them change their view. And I think that the threat at the moment is very, very clear, as indeed the government now seems belatedly to have recognised. But they should have been aware of this a year ago and acted differently.
The final question is COVID related. So we got there eventually, and you've just given us some food for thought there. Kevin Gibney asks, during the COVID-19 response, Johnson's government has displayed a record of trying to draw power into the executive through avoiding parliamentary scrutiny. And he's also, Kevin adds, raised tensions with regional mayors. Kevin asks, is it time for a UK-wide constitutional convention to firmly define the limits of power at each level of government?
Yes, and some of us have lectured in the past about written constitutions, but I am about to give a reality check. I just don't think at the moment this is going to happen. There are grounds for a complete constitutional review about the way the UK operates, and indeed that might be a way of solving some of the issues around Scotland, and indeed Wales, Northern Ireland. It could all come into it, but that requires a government that firstly is operating in a relatively calm environment, and also a government that can build relationships with the devolved governments. I have to say, in fairness to even Boris Johnson, building that sort of relationship with the Scottish National Party has always been rather difficult because they want independence. So there's always the sense that if you want to have a cooperative discussion about constitutional change short of independence, they will simply try to exploit it in order to further their independence aims. It's always been the problem. But that said, yes, it would be desirable, but I'm afraid I don't think it's going to happen. We'll only get a constitutional convention and actually rethink our constitutional relationships probably after Scotland, there's been some seismic disaster. This is usually when you do get constitutional change and somebody thinks that we ought to do it. And it's usually you bolt the stable door after the horse is gone. So I think it's very unlikely that we will get it. The spats with the mayors were completely unnecessary. I mean, just to have a disagreement with Andy Burnham over £5 million did strike me as being rather remarkable in the circumstances. Everybody is swimming around with COVID, trying to find a way out of this crisis, which minimises damage to the economy and also prevents the hospitals being flooded with seriously ill patients. There is no easy answer. The better course for Johnson would be to be honest about the difficulties, but it's too late now, I think. And also to maintain the standards and reputation of government, which would have meant parting company with Mr. Cummings when he did his Barnard Castle excursion. Tough on him, because actually I'm quite sympathetic to the difficulties he faced. But if you want to set benchmark rules, you've got to observe them yourself. And actually, the evidence at the moment is that the rule, obeying the rules, is collapsing in the UK.
Mm.
And that's a direct consequence of the way the government itself has behaved over this.
Mm. Well, I think that's a fitting place to end. And of course, we look to the future and how things will play out. We're still in the middle of this crisis. It's not going anywhere unless we get a vaccine and a more coordinated response. But thank you very much for your time today, Dominic Grieve. And thank you to everyone for watching online. It's been very interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.